Unmask the supernatural. Explore the history and future of parapsychology. Analyze legends and folklore. And welcome entertaining and informative guests as they probe irresistible mysteries that continue to haunt us. They may not always agree. In fact, they won't. But the Dueling Parapsychologists provide an investigative podcast that's not afraid to seek the truth and separate nonsense. With your hosts, Elliott Van Dusen and Darryll Walsh. Welcome to the Dueling Parapsychologists Podcast.
All right, welcome to episode 2 of the Dueling Parapsychologist Podcast. I'm Elliott Van Dusen, and this is Darryll Walsh. And tonight we have a very special guest for you. His name is Loyd Auerbach. He's a parapsychologist from California. He has been in the field for 40 plus years. He's an expert in poltergeists, which is what we will be discussing tonight. Teaches parapsychology. He's president of the Forever Family Foundation. And he's also a teacher at the Rhine Education Center. He is also one of the people that got Darryll involved in parapsychology.
He certainly is, because of this book. Back in 1986, I read his book. And 10 years later, it was very good because it got me into parapsychology. I married parapsychology, which I had grown up with on an unofficial basis, into my psychology and graduate psychology. And so I began teaching parapsychology. So it'll be nice to speak to him and to thank him for essentially turning my life this way instead of probably a better paying way that way. But anyway, more fun this way than the other one. So yeah, it'd be very interesting to actually meet somebody who has changed your life in a dramatic way. So I'm looking forward to it. I really am.
All right, everyone. So thanks for joining us here. We got a special guest tonight, Loyd Auerbach. Loyd is a parapsychologist out in California, and he's been doing this for a very long time. Loyd, why don't you tell everybody how you got started in parapsychology?
It actually goes back to an interest I had as a kid because of television and comic books more than anything else, and discovering that there were actually science books on the field when I was about 12 years old. Found books by J.B. Ryan and other people in the library. So I really got into the field about little over 42 years ago, or almost 42 years ago. I sort of got started in high school. I started a parapsychology club thanks to a couple of my teachers, and got to meet some New York area parapsychologists who later became my colleagues, and one of them became my boss for a little while, in fact. So it's been a long time interest of mine, and I was just fortunate when I finished college that there actually was a master's program, an accredited master's program in parapsychology here in California at the time.
And you did your master's degree at JFK University, right?
Right, John F. Kennedy University, which unfortunately no longer exists as such. It has been subsumed by National University now.
So it's interesting, Darryll, I think I've told you I've taken a few courses from you. Anyone that knows Loyd knows that he teaches lots of parapsychology courses, especially at the Rhine Education Center. And Darryll actually got into the field of parapsychology because of your work back in the day. I
forgot to get your book out of the bookcase right here that I read. And the most important thing that I took from it, as you said, the ways that you can work in parapsychology, because there wasn't a lot in 1980, 81, whenever the book you put it out. And one of them, though, was that you could teach. Now, coincidentally, I was well schooled in parapsychology and paranormal and ghosts in particular since I was a child. So 1996, there was an advertisement in the Chronicle Herald here in Halifax saying, if you had any idea for a course, would you please send it in to us? So I did, just because I was following your advice. And so sure enough, they interviewed me, said, that's fine. I taught that for over 12 years. And it was wonderful. It was a very wonderful class. I had, except for one class where they were rather dead already, but except for like one
Yeah.
class, everybody, and I made a dirty joke, and they laughed at the two ladies who, very prim and proper, and wouldn't joke about anything, and you couldn't. There's nothing worse when you're teaching and everybody is silent and they have a stone face. But so that was the class I was dealing with. So I thought I'd make kind of a joke. Actually, it wasn't quite dirty, that one. I made two of them, but I made one about maybe it was a little bit about a joke about my haunted rocking chair, and how somebody in the media had asked me, "Oh, has your rocking chair, rocked since, and I said, no. I said, I can't get the living in my bedroom, let alone the dead." And I told, well, my God, they thought that was the most funniest thing they ever heard. And that's the only time I got a reaction out of that class. But besides them, of the 12 years and God, my God, 36 classes that I taught, it was a very interesting experience. And it was good for them to ask me questions and give me some input about the field. And I really enjoyed it. And I've actually kind of retooled it. But then, of course, COVID came. And with COVID, there goes the idea of having in person. So I'm going to have to wait a year before I can actually teach parapsychology again. But it's because of you. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I can definitely relate to the dead audience type thing.
Oh my God.
Partly as a performer, also having been a magician and currently a mental. But I have to say that it's even worse when you are doing webinars and you can't see anybody.
Yeah.
and you ask for questions or responses and there's nothing.
Yeah.
So we have a kind of a line that several of us in the company I work for have used. When we get no feedback at all, we just silence is golden. I guess we're okay. And we just keep going.
That's true, Loyd. I think you had mentioned that before, that you find that's the one thing about teaching parapsychology online, is that you don't get that direct facial and body language.
Teaching anything online. I mean, I have been a public speaking coach in the past too. And, I've been involved quite a bit with really looking at how we present virtually, not just parapsychology, but other subjects too. And the problem is that when you are in front of an audience, you actually get energy back from the audience. Even if they're that dead stone-faced group, you may not get the best energy in that sense, but you still get energy back. You have and kind of an unconscious perception, whether it's not really psychic, but it's nonverbal, and you don't really get that unless at least people are on camera, and most people don't keep their cameras turned on.
Yeah, exactly. I went, and while you were talking, I went and got the book. That's the one.
Yeah, I suspected that was 86.
86. Let's just see what it says.
That's funny. You've got.
Yeah,
that.
You're right. 1986. That's.
Yeah, I think I kind of know. Yeah.
I like the house. I like the house.
That's funny. He's got that book because I just ordered 3 of your books off Amazon, and I've got probably your newer version that you would released. It's bigger paper. But one of the things that you ended up kind of specializing in parapsychology is poltergeists, and I know you've worked on a few interesting cases. One of the interesting cases that I find that you worked on was the choking ghost poltergeist case. Can you tell us a bit about that? Yeah.
So I've dealt with apparition cases, haunting cases, poltergeist cases. I find in many respects, poltergeist cases are some of the most interesting because first of all, they're solvable. Unlike sometimes the apparition and haunting cases, you really can't solve them per se. You can stop them. I mean, you can actually finalize or stop the phenomena, and you get potentially people who could continue to move things consciously or do things consciously. Because as you know, poltergeist, the way we use it, it refers to unconscious psychokinesis that recurs over and over again, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. And it's usually a result of stress or neurological issues, one or the other, sometimes both. So I had this case that came into JFK. It's back when we had our graduate parapsychology program. And one of my colleagues and I worked heavily on it. We had a woman who called us up, excuse me, who said that she was being choked by this shadowy entity that would pop up and grab her by the throat and throttle her and then leave. So obviously not trying to kill her, because it apparently had multiple attacks and not a single one of them was deadly. But it did cause bruising. And she reported that one of the last attacks before she called us at the university was at her boss's house. And it was, she claimed, witnessed, although they didn't see the figure, the attack itself was witnessed by a group of people.
Right.
All right. So she came to the university. We had her come and meet myself and Sharon Solfin, now Sharon Frankmont. And we met with her. She came in wearing a scarf. She also came in with one of her coworkers. Now, a little back up here. She had been a police officer in San Francisco. When she got divorced because of family issues, she moved to Alaska, where she became a police officer up there, leaving her 6-year-old son with her husband here in the Bay Area. She came back 10 years later, moved back to the Bay Area, and rather than becoming a police officer, because Silicon Valley was really just getting started at that point, she was able to get a job for a company that also had some defense contracts. So most of the people were either ex-military police or ex-police. So they all carried guns. You know, this is a high-tech, high-secure area. So this is not a woman who is want to make stuff up, typically.
Yeah.
She took off her scarf and she has bruises on her throat. Her buddy from work, she tells us the story first. He's there. He's listening. She tells us that she went to the bathroom, came out of the bathroom. It was for a barbecue at her boss's house. She came out of the bathroom, saw the figure, screamed. People came running. It grabbed her. It lifted her up off the ground. As they came to see where she was, they saw her off the ground. And then all of them, because they were there, it scared it away, whatever it was. I immediately turned to the guy and I said, "What did you see?" And he did not look very happy. He was conflicted. He said, "Margie, we did not see you levitate. We did not see you off the ground. We saw you slide down the wall. Your feet were on the ground already, slide down the wall. We did see the bruise marks appear on your throat, however, which is the main reason I'm here." So Sharon and I decided, since most of the attacks happened in and around her, where she was living in Pacifica at the time, just south of San Francisco, we went down to her mom's apartment. Now, she had moved back only about 6 months before, and she was just building enough equity to get her own apartment, get her own place. She was living with her mother. We walked in. First, I'll have to say that Margie was an incredibly talented artist, portrait artist. I was surprised she was working as a police officer. I told her that she could have gotten a job doing comic books at that point for quite a bit more money than she was making as a security officer.
Yes.
She then told us, she and her mother told us a story about a neighbor's kid, and she had a premonition. Margie had a premonition, a dream, a very strong dream that the kid was going to get, because this place was right on the beach in Pacifica, the apartment house, and the kid was going to go into the surf and was going to die in the surf. So Margie was very upset because she tried to tell the neighbor, and lo and behold, the thing happened. The neighbor did not listen. The neighbor thought she was a witch or something like that. Even worse, after the neighbor avoided her completely. So that was creating some stress right there. As we're there talking about that situation and about the previous attacks with her and her mother, Margie got up and went to the kitchen. Now, I was sitting facing the kitchen. Sharon and the mother were in chairs facing away from the kitchen. Mm-hmm. All right, so I could see what Margie was doing. She had been sitting on a sofa on the side. She goes over to the sink. She wants a glass of water. She asks any of us if we want any water. No, no, no. She turns on the faucet, starts getting a glass of water, takes the glass for a minute, puts it down, turns off the faucet, turns around, walks over to the hallway, and looks down towards the front door like she heard something. Now I can see that whole hallway. Nothing's there. She comes back to the sink. The same thing happens a second time. She goes back to the sink. She does the same thing with the water. She puts the glass down. I am like mentally hearing tubular bells in my head. This is where the spooky music is coming in. I know, I mean, it's very clear something's happening. So I'm ready for whatever. She turns around. I was out of my chair as she turned around because of the look on her face. She screamed. She falls to the floor. I actually caught her before she hit the floor because you could tell that something was going to happen. Nothing psychic about that. Sharon and the mother didn't know what was going on. All right. So Margie's hands never touched her throat. As Sharon came over, Margie's throat bulged out like a bullfrog's. 4 depressions on one side, 1 on the other. She squeaks out, "Get it off me, get it off me." I'm holding her hands. I yell. I had been only in the Bay Area for about a year and a half, coming from New York. And I became a New Yorker again. I used some choice language. Told it where to go, which is basically what I would do with anybody in New York I didn't like. And to my surprise, if this really, because I didn't know if this was an entity or what was going on, it stopped. And Sharon looked at me, and Sharon was not only a good psychologist, she's also gifted psychic. And she sensed absolutely nothing and gave me a nod about that. Mm-hmm. So I basically said, "Margie, it's going to stay away." And I yelled again and just told it never to bother her again. So it stopped. So running through my mind is either, if this is an entity, it's afraid of me, which is great. It's a good thing to know going forward. Sharon and I kind of ducked aside for a moment. Sharon confirmed she wasn't picking up anything from the outside. We sat Margie down. We start talking. Her mother then says, as we're kind of calming her down, "You should tell them about the nightmares." Well, it turns out that shortly after Margie moved back down to the Bay Area and started living with her mom, she started having nightmares, which turned out to be recovered memories of her father molesting her as a child. And Sharon immediately glommed onto that and started asking questions about the timing of the nightmares and the attacks. And then the mother says, "You should tell them about the therapist." So Margie is seeing a therapist for her dreams and the recovered memories, for all of that, not mentioning at all anything to the therapist about the attacks. In fact, she would wear a scarf when she went to see a therapist to not show the bruises. So then with some significantly more questioning about her son, because it turned out her son was visiting usually 1 weekend a month, would stay with them down in Pacifica. Now that Margie was back, he was 16 at this point. And Sharon asked a very vital question. Looking around the apartment, "Where do you sleep?" Because it's a 1-bedroom apartment. And Margie said, "Well, it's a sofa bed, a queen size sofa bed." "And where does your son sleep?" "Well, he sleeps in the sofa bed with me." And apparently the timing wise, when Sharon did some more digging psychologically, turned out the attacks, first of all, the nightmare started almost immediately after the weekend the first weekend the son was there. So the trigger for the nightmares, so the recovered memories, was the son being in that proximity to his mother. And when we informed the therapist of this, because the therapist did not know didn't know anything about sleeping, it was like a big aha moment for the therapist. We got permission to talk to the therapist from Margie, of course. The other thing was that the attacks started after the first therapy session, when Margie started talking about her father. So Sharon said, "Do you think that the figure is your father?" And she said, "No, it's just trying to shut me up," which is exactly what the therapist said when we explained what was going on. Margie was feeling guilty about talking about her father like that. So I guess you could say her monster from the id, from her unconscious, something she created, it was a self-directed poltergeist attack. There was no entity. It was her unconscious mind. And by the way, because we got to talk to the therapist, and then Margie talked to the therapist within a week after this attack, there were no more attacks.
Wow.
Now, it could be that I did scare off something. We don't really know for sure, but I tend not to think so.
Interesting. And so that's great that she never had any other attacks after that.
Yeah.
And you kind of explained what poltergeists are. And it's my understanding as well that the UK kind of looks at poltergeists a little bit differently. There's, like, in North America, we consider poltergeists to be the RSPK, but over in the UK, they kind of do things a little bit different. Can you just
well, yeah, I mean, what you find is the term poltergeist, it's really a bad term in some respects, because although it was coined back in as far back as the 16th century in Germany to describe ghostly activity, or basically unusual physical activity, as opposed to a ghost, which may appear to someone, and there might still be movement or such. Poltergeist was always used in those circumstances where there was physical activity, and that was the main element for all the situation. So in the UK, if there is physical activity at all, other than the one-off type thing, they will potentially use that term poltergeist, and then they'll split it out. Who's causing the poltergeist activity? Is it a living person, or is it a discarnate or deceased person, a ghost? And for us, if it's physical activity and there's no initial indication of an actual conscious entity, we will just call it a poltergeist. Whereas if there is initial activity that seems to be possibly a conscious entity or possibly just an imprint, we'll label that an apparition case. And in that case, apparitions might learn how to move things. Mm-hmm. But in poltergeist cases, we don't have the kind of quality, the descriptions of apparitions or communication, things like that, that we have in apparition cases.
That's interesting. So Darryll and I are kind of looking into the Enfield poltergeist case a little bit there for a possible television series, and they call it the Enfield poltergeist. Right. But there's a few things about the Enfield poltergeist case that kind of doesn't fit the RSPK theory. For example, the young girl Janet speaking in the male voice that was allegedly a deceased person kind of thing, and I guess that would explain why they kind of call it a poltergeist case over there in the UK.
Right.
Now obviously it had some poltergeist activity there, but it also had other phenomena occurring as well.
Well, and honestly, we've had cases where there has been an apparition and there's poltergeist activity. In fact, I had one case where the appearance of the apparition caused the stress for one of the family members, which generated the poltergeist activity. So the apparition was in fact the stimulus, but the apparition was not directly causing any of the phenomena.
Wow, that's really interesting. The other question I've been dying to ask you as well, we kind of talked about it a little bit through email there. Which case, because you're a science-based parapsychologist, which case stands out to you that you've investigated where you couldn't find like a rational or reasonable explanation for it, that in your mind you think 100% it was paranormal?
Well, I've had a few cases, and I assume you mean rational explanation that's not parapsychological.
Yes.
Because to me, those are rational explanations. So, I mean, I have several apparition cases like that. I've got the case that I wrote up extensively in Leslie Kean's book, Surviving Death, about a family of three plus the woman's mother, who were all seeing an apparition for quite a long time separately without talking about it to each other. And then turns out their son was communicating with the apparition on a daily basis. And the information we got in the investigation from the boy, from the apparent spirit, from Lois, the ghost, was so extensive. And there were two types of information. One was about the history of the city of Livermore, California, which honestly, I didn't count at all, because he could have read it. Even if he didn't remember he read it, but he could have read it. But then there was family information, which we had to track down the only living relative of the woman. And I got to speak to him, and the stories that we were told, the family stories, because the woman who was the ghost grew up in that house with her family in the area. And she had one living relative, and I tracked him down. And actually I tracked him down because the kid gave us the information from the ghost, and he confirmed the stories. In fact, I would tell him to start telling a story and he would finish the story. So it was almost as if there was an intention to provide stories that could be verified, rather than, I mean, I got a lot of family stories that nobody in my family is going to remember. So, we all have those kinds of stories.
Wow. That's really interesting.
So that was a key case. I can say that the cases of the USS Hornet Aircraft Carrier Museum, which is very active, there's enough evidence, enough witnesses, and enough activity. The case that I've dealt with for years, the Moss Beach Distillery, there is enough witness testimony going back to the 1930s. There's enough activity, there's enough communication, some of which was verified in very odd ways, that those all support the concept of conscious survival of death for me. And there's more.
I'm interested in, personally interested in deathbed visions. Have you done any research into that? It's fascinating to me, the fact that somebody is on the point of death and somebody comes for them. That's fine. It's usually a deceased husband or mother or father or whatever. Right. And some of them, however, it's somebody they did not know had died 2 days previous, because the family decided we're not going to tell them because, you know, they're a very, you know, whatever. And they all of a sudden say, oh, there's Gina, you know, and her sister. And, you know, this is by a lady. This is not just a lady, what we call a female, but a lady, you know, in Britain. And so it's lady, whatever her name is. And so she's not just somebody. She's actually quite a high status person. And she was working at this hospital and this happened. And I'm just kind of curious if you came across a lot of this at all. You might not come across any of it, but I'm just curious if you did.
Well, I mean, I've certainly done a lot of reading in that area, and I know of cases where that has happened. I've talked to hospice workers, you know, at parties and things, who, when they've told me, when I found out who I am, they start telling me their stories. So there's quite a lot of stories that are there, and often accompanying those visions are instances of hyperlucidity, where the person was sedated, in a coma, had Alzheimer's, and all of a sudden comes out of it, and not only has a conversation that people witness with this apparent spirit, but also can lucidly communicate with the living people in the room.
Exactly.
Which is, you know, I know that there are non-believers or skeptic type medical researchers who are looking at hyperlucidity and trying to find the reason this happens, period. And of course, they're excluding anything psychic or paranormal here. But there's something more going on for sure than just a function of the brain.
Because I mean, a person can't, if they have Alzheimer's, their brain is essentially being eaten away by the plaque and being destroyed.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden they're lucid and they're communicating with loved ones and the dead, we assume. How do you explain when the brain is essentially mush, you know, towards the end of your life? It's an interesting, you know, the skeptics really, they fall back on the same old usual things, you know, like a lack of oxygen to the brain, or it's this or it's that, and it hasn't changed in the 40 years that I've been looking at near-death experiences.
Right.
You know, and it's just amazing, but it's amazing the fact that all of a sudden somebody whose brain is scrambled yet can become lucid and intelligent enough to carry on a conversation, which maybe 6 years they haven't been able to do. So how do you explain that? Well, obviously.
Well, and the coincidence of them also seeing apparitions at the same time is bizarre. I mean, if you know, if you can become hyperlucid, get out of those situations, but you also have to see apparitions at the time. Yeah. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but that's a bizarre. That's going to be really hard to explain. And it's going to be hard to explain how someone is under sedation or is fading for some other reason, and someone has Alzheimer's and they both get hyperlucid, because there are completely different situations happening in those brains.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's a good point. Our last episode too, Loyd, we talked a little bit about the history of you know, parapsychology, talked a little bit about the spiritualism movement, and we talked about magicians and mentalists. And you also, besides teaching parapsychology and doing field investigations, are also involved in that field there. Can you tell us a little bit about how you bring those skills to your field investigations?
Sure. When I was in my graduate studies, we had a course called Creation of Illusions taught by a local magician. And this was a course that our department chair, John Palmer, insisted we take, which nobody was complaining about it, which taught us basic principles of the psychology of magic and mentalism, We had to learn a few magic tricks here and there, mentalism tricks. We had to do some projects on that. And I realized at that time two things. First of all, although I had loved magic since I was a kid, I never really got into it. But I was bartending my way through grad school at the time. So the first thing I realized is these will make me more tips. So I started performing magic behind the bars that I was working at. And the other thing I realized was that what we were learning was not just about determining if there's a phony psychic. That was part of it. I mean, part of what we were dealing with was to make sure that we had an understanding of what someone approaching us for laboratory studies might be able to do with fraud, with magic. But I realized that there was much more of an application to understanding how people perceive magic tricks, how they see, how their perception works, and how that could apply to things in the real world and in the paranormal world, more or less. Mm-hmm. So I started doing more reading and really started actually getting involved with a magician's group. After grad school, I moved back to New York for a couple of years, and I joined a magician's group with the intention of performing, of actually learning to perform, because I love performing behind the bar. I'd done comedy in college. It made sense for me to do that as well. And I was very lucky that one of my colleagues, somebody who I'd actually met when I graduated from JFK at one of the parapsychology conventions, Marcello Truzzi, really encouraged me when I started talking to him, because he was a mentalist as well, talking to him about that I wanted to start performing, and he was really encouraging me to do that. Plus, I had been introduced to the founder of the Bay Area Skeptics, Bob Steiner, who was not such a bad skeptic here in the Bay Area before I left, also a magician, also encouraging me not just to learn magic, but to perform. Because as a performer, I mean, you can read all the magic books you want, and you'll get a grasp. But performing for real people, you learn so much more, even by making mistakes of what doesn't work. You learn so much more about an understanding of perception. And that has served me well in going out and doing investigations, as well as uncovering psychic fraud. I definitely have done that a few times, more than a few times. I've consulted with some of my colleagues also about laboratory controls for things. So it's really been an important thing for me. And Marcello actually kept pushing me, as did one of my other colleagues, Chuck Honorton, who had a lab in Princeton, New Jersey, when I was working in New York. There were a couple of other people who I consider my mentors, who just really were very, very much supportive and actually pushing me towards learning more and more magic. And Marcello actually pushed me away from the comedy magic I was doing in the 80s. I was actually performing in comedy clubs in the 80s. He kept on saying, you know, people aren't going to take you seriously if you're doing comedy. It's like, so he wanted me to do more traditional, serious mentalism. And that lasted about a month because I couldn't be serious. So I developed my Professor Paranormal persona, which is still me. It's just with a bit of humor involved there, quite a bit of that. So I've been doing that for a long time. I got involved with the Psychic Entertainers Association in 1997, again, thanks to Marcello. So it's been a real good ride, and it's been an amazing kind of secondary parallel career for me. Although COVID, I decided not to go for the virtual show route, which many of my colleagues did. I'm looking forward to actually doing live shows again with a real audience coming up. Oh, and by the way, I should mention, because you guys are in Halifax, my good friends, Bill and Esther Van Gorder, are mentalists in the area. Bill and Esther are very, very active in the theater community in Halifax.
Oh, wow.
Oh, well, we'll check into that.
Yeah, that's great to know. That's awesome. No, that's really good. Certainly, you can see how it would help you detect, you know, especially psychic fraud. We talked a little bit about that last episode too. What did you call them? Something vampire?
Grief vampires.
Grief vampires. Yes.
Well, there are grief vampires and there are showboaters. There's two different kinds, because not all psychics have anything to do with grief. In fact, most of the phony psychics don't have anything to do with grief. You might call them curse vampires or money vampires, because some of the worst phony psychic fortune teller types will tell people there's a curse on them, and I can help remove it if, you know, for X number of thousands of dollars. Yeah. But Yeah.
You see that a lot, or you see the house clearing charges, and some of those can be like astronomical. And as you teach in parapsychology, that is one thing that should be a huge red flag if you have an investigative team saying that they can guarantee to get rid of this entity or clear the house, because we don't even know how consciousness works, let alone to be able to get that person or whatever it is to move along.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some success, but you can't guarantee that at all.
There's a good word for all these people. It's called assholes. That's essentially what they are. I mean, to blatantly lie and take, like you said, thousands of dollars of money from people. I mean, I could have done that myself when I started out, same with Elliott. And, we could have made a fortune just by doing very little of all that, because there's a lot of gullible people out there, and there's a lot of people who need that. And, but, there's some part of myself and Elliott that just stayed away from it, because it's just, it's unconscionable. I mean, it's just something it's almost unforgivable that especially the grief vampires, that you would prey upon, people who are very, very, desperate to know there's an afterlife and everything. So,
well, the problem here is that, and I've seen this even with genuine mediums, you have most people who see genuine mediums are in grief, not always. And if it's been a while, then they're not in grief, just they have an interest. But the problem here is that if the medium is ethical, and also we deal with evidential mediums and people who actually have real abilities, the issue then becomes, are those people willing to take what the medium provides to them and continue their process of grief resolution? The people who founded the Forever Family Foundation, which is a nonprofit that supports the work of mediums in the grieving process, they were in grief. A medium seeing a neighbor ended up in communication with their daughter who had died in a car accident. And Bob Ginsberg did not believe it. I mean, it took him months of getting information from this medium, eventually firsthand from the medium, to have her convince him. But what he saw was how much grief relief his wife Fran was getting, and then how much he got. He actually wrote a book about it and about dealing with mediums called The Medium Explosion, which I highly recommend. And what we see, however, is, and this happened at one of our conferences where we had we had scientists presenting information about research on the life after death stuff, and we had mediums doing their kind of gallery readings. And there was one woman who ended up, every one of the mediums connected with her apparent son, who had died in a car accident, that while she was driving, the son's best friend ended up with some brain damage, if I recall. And she blamed herself because she was a distracted driver. All right. So the message from the son, and there was a lot more than just this, but the message from the son was, Mom, I forgive you. You got to move on with your life. You have to stop grieving. At the very least, see a psychologist. I mean, there was like one thing, right? All the good advice that you would have gotten, right? Every one of the mediums struck out because she just couldn't let it go. So this was a woman who's going to keep seeing medium after medium, no matter what. Yeah. And those people, there's not a lot you can do for them. No. I mean, you can tell them not to see mediums, then they're going to see nobody. So at some point, I'm assuming, we have to assume that someone is either going to get her into therapy, is going to be strong enough to do that, whether it's a medium or someone else, or she's just going to finally accept it. We hope. Yeah. But it's those kind of people that the phonies really can glom onto and really suck dry. Yeah. Most people, they really can't unless they're afraid.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is. It's really interesting. Actually, I had a similar experience as well. Our film producer friend, Donna Davies, did a documentary about Nova Scotia, mediums and psychics in Atlantic Canada. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to, after my dad passed away, I was only 22 at the time. He died at the age of 48, he had gotten hepatitis C through the tainted blood scandal. So the hep C ended up taking him out. And I had a chance when I worked with the RCMP, I had a chance to go back home. I was in the West Coast, British Columbia, and I had a chance to go home to Nova Scotia, so on the East Coast, for 4 days. But the cost of flights and for 4 days was such a minimal amount of time for such an expensive trip that I was told I could take as much time as I wanted if I could just get through the summer, because there was leave restriction in the town that I worked in, because the population doubles because of tourists. And so I never made it to the fall. He passed away on August 14th of 2006. And so I always regretted that. And I held that burden for a little while. So after our friend Donna had done the documentary, I asked, who did she find was the most accurate psychic or medium? And she had put me in touch with a lady, and I had gone there. And that's one of the things that she had told me. Actually, she claimed that, my father had come to her, and that was one of the first things she said was that, Elliott, it's okay. And you just got to move on. Like, it is what it is, basically, to put it in less formal words. And it actually gave me peace, actually. So, whether she was, telling the truth or,
Not, yeah.
That's the thing. She certainly didn't convince me to keep coming back to see her.
Well, that's it. I think the phonies would take somebody like you or that woman and would actually make the message about, you need to keep coming to see me. You need to, have to do X, Y, and Z. Not like, stop seeing mediums. That's the message.
Yeah.
There are people who are good readers of people. I mean, I there's a spectrum. There are people who are truly psychic. There are people who are truly phonies, like conscious, taking advantage of people phonies. But in between, there are also people who think that they're psychic because they've been told that, because they're very intuitive or very observant. And if they mean well, they can do well. There are also people who learn techniques like cold reading and such techniques, and they might do that in the back of like a psychic shop or the back of a new age shop. And there are some really compassionate people who really do want to help people, but they don't want to go through the process of becoming a psychologist. And they also don't charge a bloody fortune. I mean, their readings are not that expensive, right? So then you also have true psychics, or people who are really psychic, who are extremely unethical, who have no compassion whatsoever.
Yeah.
And frankly, those people are more dangerous than some of the phonies.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I first started teaching parapsychology, was the fact that, like you said, the back room of the the shop. I had done nothing. I had not related to anybody else that was a psychic. I had not talked about them. I was just giving the science of parapsychology, and my students could take what they wanted from that. And I learned that at least two hated my guts, although they never met me. They didn't know what my curriculum was. They had heard nothing about what I was actually teaching. So then I instantly figured out that they were the phonies, and they felt threatened because there was somebody doing a scientific approach to the paranormal.
Right.
And so it wasn't hard to tell who was who, and because of that. But it was rather funny just to hear it. That somebody really hates you, who you've never met, never talked about.
Oh well, I don't know if you know the name Sylvia Brown.
Yes.
Oh yes.
Yeah, Sylvia Brown hated my guts. I gave her some really good reasons to, though. Mainly because I talked very frankly about her to reporters, and she was at one point, she and her husband were arrested for a gold mine scam. They basically conned some clients out of money, claiming that she had discovered a gold mine psychically that had been played out but really wasn't, and they were investing their money into it. And so she got 3 years probation. But anytime after that happened, because it hit the Associated Press and the local press, anytime that happened and somebody would ask me about Sylvia Brown, or I heard they were going to see a psychic and they mentioned her name, I would send them the article.
Yeah.
And that, and there were a few other things. So, I do know because a cameraman for one of the TV shows who had been involved with interviewing me, mentioned my name to her while they were interviewing her, and he said she went ballistic. He actually said he wished he had the camera running because, how did he put it? He had never heard words like that come out of a woman's mouth about somebody.
Wow.
Well, it's interesting because when I was doing the TV series Shadowhunter, which I hosted in 2005, and so we were in Toronto, and we were interviewing the supposed, what was he, psychic? I forget what he called himself. But anyway, what happened would be that the director, Donna Davies, would sit in and ask the questions because she knew exactly what she needed to get from the interviewee. And then they would bring me in to ask a few questions and get, my going, yes, yes, yes,
Right.
know the thing. You've been through it a million times, the thing. So anyway, I came up at the very beginning. I shook his hand and, introduced myself, explained what was going to happen. Very friendly, whatever. Then I went back and sat with the rest of the crew, well behind Donna, actually. And so anyway, at one point after the interview, we did all this and I sat in and blah, blah, blah. I'm out in the hallway and one of the crew comes out and says, my God, he fucking hates you. And it's, what? Yeah. And it was as soon as Donna said, I was a parapsychologist. It was different from the host from a TV show. She said, I was a parapsychologist. And that threatened him enough that all of a sudden he almost went ballistic on her. And actually, it never made it into the show. None of it. She cut it out because she knew he was a phony right from the start.
Right.
Yeah. And
well, there are also true believers. I worked heavily with a woman named Annette Martin, who was a psychic and medium for many, many years. I mean, she was a phenomenal psychic. One of the few I know who actually ended up with a partner who had been the homicide detective she had worked with extensively here in the Bay Area. He retired, became a private investigator, and she still continued to work with him. So he and some other people verified how useful she was to local police and to other police around the country. But she and I would do events because of my mentalism background, and Annette had been an opera singer and an actress when she was in the 1950s and early 60s. And so she was a performer herself. And she loved the mentalism stuff that I did. So we would do shows, evenings together where I would do my mentalism thing and she would do her mediumship piece. And we called it the fantasy and the reality. And we did it typically at haunted restaurants so where we had done investigations or other places. So we did one night, and actually, as it happened, the night we did it, we had a few members of the Bay Area Skeptics who actually had such a good time that they didn't have anything bad to say about Annette, which was kind of fun. That was nice. Two women approached us after the show because normally I would go first, and there was a bit of humor, and then I would put on my parapsychologist hat and introduce Annette, and then she would do her thing. So these two women approach us, and we're standing there together, and the two women turn and look at Annette, ignoring me completely, and they said, how can you possibly work with this man? He's making fun of what you do. As if I'm not there. And Annette looked at me and smiled and looked back at them and said, because it's fun. And if I can't have fun with my job, I don't want to do it. Lighten up. So, true believers, true disbelievers.
No, exactly. Whatever ideology, whether it's political, religious, or whatever, when you bump into a true believer, there was one who contacted me and wanted to have a discussion on orbs. And this was just after it was debunked actually by a UFO guy back in the 90s. And since then, obviously, it's been repeated that orbs are not ghosts.
Right.
And I said to her, there's no point in my speaking to you. You believe it's a ghost with absolutely no evidence other than the fact that you took a picture and something weird showed up on your camera. Mm-hmm. I said, obviously, there's no point in us discussing anything because there's going to be no give and take, and you're not going to learn anything. And then she never contacted me again. And I've stayed away from true believers ever since because it is, it is just there. It's a psychiatric syndrome, essentially, obsessive compulsive. And in the 50s, there was, oh God, I wish I could remember his name. There's probably his book is up there, who learned that people could, in the 40s, could jump from being Nazi to communist or vice versa. And he learned it didn't really matter what the extreme behavior and beliefs were. It was the fact that they locked onto one of them, and for some reason they could switch over. Even Ronald Reagan was a Democrat until the middle 60s, and then all of a sudden became a Republican. And St. Paul is another one who, of course, persecuted Christians, and then all of a sudden became the person who essentially created the Catholic Church as the Pauline Church instead of the Jamesian Church of Jesus' brother. So, true believers like that have really, altered worldwide events, but also on the personal, when you're relating to them as a parapsychologist, it can be very difficult, because it's pointless.
Well, it's the same with true disbelievers.
Yeah, exactly.
The people who call themselves skeptics,
yeah,
but argue often from a lack of knowledge about something. The number of skeptics, fake skeptics, pseudo skeptics, as Marcello Truzzi used to call them, that when Darryll Bem's article on his paper on precognition study he was doing at Cornell, that hadn't even been published. It was just announced for the upcoming journal without anybody knowing what the results were. It could have been that his results were chance, but without that, there was such an attack on the journal and on Darryll Bem, who was an amazing, really well-respected social scientist, social psychologist, that it really showed a lack of science, a lack of scientific attitude. And a number of the people who were interviewed by journalists, they were asked, have you read the paper? And most often it was, no, why would I? Not even no, it was no, why would I? Because ESP is not possible. Precognition is not possible. So why would I read the paper? And that's about as unscientific as you can possibly get.
Absolutely.
That's the problem right there. There are people who will, skeptics will say, it's not possible for this reason, this reason, this reason. Oh, and by the way, you have no evidence. And that's because they haven't looked at the evidence or the research, or they'll cite research from the 1930s. As if there's, we're not almost 100 years past that. Yeah. So it gets to be a pointless argument, as you say. But unfortunately, a lot of these people are in positions of power, especially in academics. Here in academia in the United States, it's such a toxic environment that if faculty mention that their outside interest is in the subject, they can get censured within their department. And I know of one person years ago who actually got fired because of his outside interest. He wasn't even mentioning parapsychology in his classes, but because he had a little bit of notoriety outside the university, he got fired for it. He actually had a really good legal case, but his wife was working in an admin position at the time, and he didn't want her to lose her job too, which actually would have been a better case. I told him he should have let her lose her job, because that would actually up the ante on what they were going to get in damages. So it's really incredibly ridiculous. I talked to my colleagues about having had encounters with academics from various universities, and we all have stories about hearing them, at some meeting or some situation, they'll say this stuff doesn't exist. You're full of it, and then they pull you aside and tell you their ghost story. Yeah,
I've often been told, I don't believe in ghosts at all, but I grew up in a haunted house.
Yeah.
And, you kind of look at them thinking, you look at them and your facial expression doesn't change, but you're thinking, oh my, this is one of those,
Well, it's because they're afraid, and these folks, when you ask them, they're afraid to say anything. Yeah. It's, our society as it is makes this stuff look weird and strange. And honestly, the ghost hunting shows make it even worse.
Yes.
We won't go there. We won't go there. I won't go there. But I'm just saying.
Very fast to something else.
Yeah.
Please.
Just in general, you're weird if you're having these experiences. That's what it boils down to. And if you're an academic, how could you possibly believe in any of this stuff? Brian Josephson, who is a physicist in the UK who won the Nobel Prize years ago, was uninvited to a physics conference because of his interest in parapsychology and consciousness. He was reinvited when a number of his colleagues who, when they found out about that uninvitation, they said they weren't going to go unless he was able to come as well.
Wow.
A Nobel Prize winner. Yeah. You know, it's ridiculous, right?
Yeah, it is.
Now, the interesting thing is, you know, there's a lot of them that will publicly say there's nothing to this. It's all crap. The methodology is weak. Whatever their excuse is. But then privately, like you said, they'll either tell a ghost story or they'll ask you questions about it, whether it's Bigfoot or something like that. They're interested in the topic, some people, but when they're asked about it or they're speaking to somebody they don't know, they're very, very, hyper skeptic. And so it's really weird. And it is a bad situation in the universities now for a great many reasons, not just about the toxicity about parapsychology, but I would not go back to university to take a degree at a university because there's so much BS going on with all the, the social warrior, bad people and all this kind of thing, gender stuff, literature, film studies, it's all, anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, it's funny when you bump into them, the people that publicly disagree and then bring them, privately. And I'm glad that in that case, a Nobel Prize winner is not allowed to actually be interested in some phenomena that is, that is not explained. Yeah. And he's not allowed to actually ask the question. Right. So he's kicked out for that reason, and that's the big thing. That's interesting is that.
Well, and with Darryll Bem's stuff, what's interesting is that his statistics were looked at and completely vetted, and so the conclusion was because ESP is not real, there must be something wrong with that method of statistics.
Yeah.
But what that did was, since his method of statistics, he's an incredible social psychologist. Bayesian statistics is at the root of a lot of psychology research. Yep. And so if there's something wrong with Bayesian statistics because of Bem's stuff, that means that they have to throw out not just his study, but a lot of psychology. Exactly. And of course, that's created a lot of controversy. This was 10 years ago. It's still not settled at this point.
Well, that's the whole thing. there are people, not just parapsychologists getting into this. There are people like social psychologists. Yeah. I talked about both in my classes in the last podcast about how respected it was at the beginning because we had, very famous scientists involved and big names. And so it was looked at the beginning as something that was okay to look into because the question was there. Then it slowly changed so that, maybe it was ignored for a couple of decades. And then the 70s, I don't know what happened in the 70s.
I do.
Probably and a few other little things that they ingested. All of a sudden, you've got the Bigfoot with the UFO, and you've got these weird things going on in parapsychology, the paranormal, and all that. And then parapsychology has developed to the point now that it's a science, but it's still looked at, and they don't, like you said, they don't think about what they're saying. If they keep complaining about the methodology, and they're always complaining about the methodology, it's like you said, it throws out an awful lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, it's just a shit show would be a good way to put it sometimes,
Well, what happened in the 60s and 70s out of the counterculture mind expansion thing was what was called in publishing the occult explosion. There was you couldn't go anywhere and not find books on the occult, parapsychology, and the unexplained, psychic stuff, the weird stuff.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Yeah, it was great. But at the same time, because so many people were jumping in on the new age bandwagon. There's so much crap. I mean, that's the problem. There's so much crap that was coming out that real stuff got lost in that. And then also in the 70s, at the tail end of that publishing explosion was the beginnings of organized skepticism, the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. And they are the organization and people like them who have caused this problem in academia. Because it's not just, to them, they make it seem you should be embarrassed that you're interested or have any serious interest in this subject or claim to have had an experience. Because it's all, and they use the term woo or woo-woo.
Mm-hmm.
And too many of them are, they're fundamentalist skeptics, as one of my colleagues put it years ago. They're dogmatic, they're disbelievers, they're cynics, they're fundamentalists actually. And they look at science as a dogma instead of as a process. And that's where we run into the problem.
Yeah, that's a really great summary, really.
I can remember being 12 years old, 1975, and I began, well, at least that's the earliest I remember, but I began to read all these books. And you could go to drugstores, in the book. There was, this section, there'd be something on Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and all this stuff. But even at 12, I could, my BS monitor or warning system was coming up, and I could understand. I could just, at that point, I wouldn't say it was BS, but I would say there's something just wrong with that just doesn't track. And of course, as I grew older and I went into psychology myself, into a bachelor's and master's and in psychology, and then of course obviously I learned when somebody's passing off BS to me and when they're not. But I also learned the strict nature of scientific methodology. And when you're putting a paper out, it's not just your opinion of something you did on the side. You've put a lot of work into it. And it says something, and that something has to be reacted to and maybe replicated. And that's what's supposed to happen, not somebody go, oh, woo woo crap, type of thing. Especially when it's not a parapsychologist, but it's a social psychologist. And so, it's in a respected field, because social psychologists are very respected. So it's just like you said, it's so toxic because you've got the fundamentalists, there.
Yeah.
Loyd, what you kind of mentioned the Forever Foundation,
Family Foundation,
yes. What is your role with them, and what do they offer people?
So I'm actually president of the foundation, which is more of a front man in some respects. We don't really do have that kind of day-to-day situation. It's an all volunteer organization. And the organization was founded in about 2004 by, as I mentioned, Bob and Fran Ginsberg. They found such grief relief from working with a medium and met other couples who had lost children or parents where the same thing had happened, that they decided to start this foundation in support of that function. But because Bob and others were so interested in the science behind the scientific studies around this phenomena, they absolutely incorporated that. So Foundation's always been an educational organization as well, to support the work of researchers and dissemination of information about the research. It's an all volunteer organization. Even the mediums are volunteers. The mediums we have that are listed on our website have gone through a testing process, a certification process, which has been double blind, and it was involved. It was a scientific process to start with. We have been trying to set this up virtually now as well, which actually in some respects makes it easier to control for a lot of variables. And not everybody passes at all. We also try to make sure there's some background check done, interviewing and such, to make sure we've got somebody coming in who's ethical. And folks can find them on the website of the Forever Family Foundation. It's foreverfamilyfoundation.org. It is a free organization to join. It is no charge to join. We do put material out every so often to our members. Members get, it's kind of free, and they still get discounts when we hold events. And our events, honestly, have never been money makers. We try to always budget them to, if we have X number of people come, then we make, then we pay off all the bills. But that doesn't always happen, so we do rely on donations as well. And we've held grief retreats in the past. Actually, we're doing the first one since the pandemic is coming up in Connecticut next month. And then we're doing one in October here in the Bay Area. Haven't done any in California before. And then there will be one in Florida in January that's happening. And those are limited to 50 people. We have a grief counselor there, a grief psychologist doing a presentation, a couple presentations, and working with people. And we have mediums doing the same as well. So it's kind of a combination of, it truly is we call it a grief transformation retreat. And if folks watch the Netflix series Surviving Death, you can see all about the Foundation's grief retreats in episode 4, the 4th episode of that. And a couple of our mediums are involved there in that episode, and also the one before that on mediumship. The 2 mental mediums, Laura Lynn Jackson and Sandra O'Hara, are 2 of our better mediums, actually, that are there.
Good. That's great. And what about your personal websites? I know you were kind of undergoing some renovations, I think, on your
site. It's a long-term project. Someday I'll actually get my website back up. I would suggest people find me on Facebook. It's Loyd.Auerbach.author. It's the facebook.com, Loyd.Auerbach.author. And if you do a search on my name, you'll find that there is a group that a couple of my students started called Loyd Auerbach's Fans and Students. And I post a lot of stuff there. That's probably the best place to really communicate with me directly. Follow me on Twitter @ProfParanormal. And then it's just, my email is just profparanormal@gmail.com. People can find me there as well. I have a couple of YouTube channels. People can find some TV appearances and lectures and such as well. And of course, people can contact me through the Rhine Center as well.
Yeah, perfect. That's great. And do you have any projects that you're working on right now? Are you working on any other books? I know I think in class you had mentioned that you had just written a fiction book based on.
Yes. Yeah, actually, this came out last fall by myself, Arnold Rudnick, and Rich Hozek. This is the first in a mystery series. The next one, actually, we're hoping to come out August 1st. We're working on the first draft of it right now. We're just going to work through it and get it edited, try to get it out by August 1st. That one's called Afterlife. This one's Near Death. That's Afterlife. We haven't figured out the title of our third one yet.
Nice, nice. And what about any parapsychology books? Are you working on anything there? So
I've been working on an essay. I don't know if you're aware of the Bigelow contest.
Yes.
We're in it, actually.
We're in it.
So, yeah. So I got talked into participating with a couple of my colleagues from the Rhine Center.
Awesome.
So I'm working on that. And slowly but surely, I'd hoped to actually have it done months ago, but I got too busy with other things. The reissue of my book, A Paranormal Casebook. So
awesome.
Hope to have that out real soon. Certainly the same time that Afterlife comes out, the fiction book. I want to try to launch that at the same time. And then other than that, I'm slowly but surely working on a kind of an autobiography. My paranormal autobiography. It's not going to cover a lot of the other stuff. I don't need to talk about my past relationships.
Well, yeah, I mean, after all the years you've put into the field, I think that would be a great book for sure.
Yeah, it would be.
There'd be a lot to learn from that. And I guess last question, what courses are you teaching coming up?
So this August, we'll be teaching, I'm teaching how to choose and assess a psychic or medium.
Oh, I like that one.
So, and that'll touch on some of the principles of magic and give people a little idea of how they can, if you go to see a psychic or medium, how do you know that you're dealing with somebody genuine? And when does it matter if they're genuine or not? Because sometimes phonies can be actually more useful than real psychics. You know, real psychics can give you information you don't care about just to prove that they're psychic.
Yeah.
But somebody who's a really good reader, but not a psychic, can sometimes tell you exactly what you really need to hear, just like a good bartender can. So we'll talk about that. And then the other is I'm co-teaching actually with John Kruth, and you can call it para-ethics. It's ethics. It's ethics in research. It is ethics in investigation and ethical issues in working with the media. And then this fall, for those who have taken the field investigations class previously, I'm teaching an advanced field investigations course. And then there's a couple of other ones we're tossing around, a couple of other titles for the fall as well, a couple of other courses that I'll be doing.
Awesome. That's great. Well, Loyd, we appreciate you taking the time out of your, I'm sure, very busy schedule to sit down and chat to us. And
at the end of a long day, I mean, you probably just want to relax after all day, being all day doing whatever you do. So we really do appreciate the fact of you spending like an hour and a bit. I can't see the clock, talking to us, and of course, personally, it was nice to actually meet the person who really got me into parapsychology. I could have just been somebody who wrote books on ghosts, folklore type of thing. But, you were the one who got me into parapsychology and married parapsychology and my psychology together.
Good.
So I thank you for that.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to hear it. Yeah.
It was nice to meet you, because it's very rare in life that we actually meet the people who do change your life, and sometimes you don't even realize it, but it's rare. So thank you again for that, and taking the time to tonight to enlighten us in so many ways. So
I told my fiance tonight, I said Darryl's kind of nervous about tonight's podcast. He goes, "Oh, why is that?" I was like, Loyd Auerbach is one of the reasons why you got into parapsychology. And I said, I guess it would be the equivalent of if I met Wayne Gretzky, I'd be like all, wired and giddy kind of thing. So yeah. So no, we appreciate you, taking the time to talk to us. And yeah.
You're very welcome.
Awesome. All right.
Great. We'll bug you again sometime later.
All right, we can argue. Not argue. We can probably commiserate about the ghost hunting shows at some point.
Oh, don't. Oh, yes. Oh, God.
Don't get them going.
No.
Yeah.
Oh,
I know.
It was what parapsychology was such a, a scientific, well-respected, you had the greatest scientific minds, mostly in England, but also around the world. And,
I know. Well, all I can say is take 2 Ghostbusters and call me in the morning.
Oh, can I shoot them? I mean, going around in basements and in green light and going, what's that? It's like, but anyway, don't get me started on that.
Okay.
Don't. But it would be a great episode. That's for sure.
Yeah.
You'd be trying to calm me down, right?
All right, Loyd. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank
All right,
you.
take care.
We'll be talking.
Right.
Well, that was great. I loved it. I got to thank I don't want to use the word hero, because I don't think of people as heroes or role models necessarily, but he comes as close to being a role model in my life than anyone else. So it was nice to talk to him. It was nice to meet him, to know the courses he teaches. He'll now recognize me, hopefully, to thank him for, sending me on this voyage. And, he's a nice guy. I mean, he's absolutely a really nice guy. And
we could have sat down and talked to him for hours long.
Oh my God, could we ever? Yeah, I mean, you could have got. We
didn't even go outside really anything besides mediums, psychics, poltergeists.
And we did an overview more so than something narrowly defined. And so in future episodes we will. And in future episodes, like I said, I'm going to go into some local stuff, some Nova Scotia and some Maritimes, and then Canada and international. It'll be all mixed up as well. We're not just going to do straight science. We're going to make it interesting as well, but we're also going to bring some science into everything. And the interesting thing about Loyd was the fact that he brought magic and comedy, believe it, into it. And so he has a very interesting life. And so it was a good interview, I think, for us to do. So
absolutely. I was glad to have somebody of his caliber to come come talk to us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've taken his courses, and
and every course I've taken from him, and again, I recommend people check out the Bryan Education Center. They have some great courses there. Those ones that he mentioned on the show are all new. I've never taken those ones.
Yes, I'm interested in that first one he mentioned.
Yes, they sound very, very interesting, and I encourage people to check it out. You're not going to find really, unless you take the Intro to Parapsychology course through University of Edinburgh, you're not going to find quality type courses like that out there. Now, Darryll and I are trying to develop, and we are in the process of developing an Introduction to Parapsychology course.
Yeah.
That's still being developed. We'll let you guys know when you can sign up for that.
Right.
It's going to be offered a little bit cheaper than the other places that offer it. The average Introduction to Parapsychology course is like roughly $200. Ours is going to be cheaper than that, just to get us started out. But it's going to be the same quality, if not hopefully better.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I taught parapsychology, I think, for 15 years, and I've always wanted to do it. I've always wanted to do it essentially online, so that at the community college, I would also be physically there for some people, but I'd also have an audience online, and it just never developed enough to be able to do that because of the introduction of the internet and ghost hunting shows. People stopped contacting you and thought they knew everything because they watched some dickhead go through a basement yelling at the ghost to talk to him. And so it never developed. But we're gonna fight that rising tide of idiocy, and both in this podcast and in a TV show that we're also developing. So
yeah, I mean, pretty much that's one of the things that we always try and do as well, is to dispel, what you should stay away from, and the bullshit, as you
just give it to you, the real parapsychology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing about Poltergeists, and we didn't bring it up with Loyd, he had never heard of the Caledonia Mills case here in Nova Scotia. It's not as popular as the Great Amherst Mystery or the Esther Cox case, which Loyd was familiar with. We didn't bring those up, but Darryll and I are both familiar with those because we're Halifax based.
Yeah.
So Darryll, what's your take on the Caledonia Mills case that happened in Nova Scotia? Give us like a brief synopsis of what the Caledonia Mills case is.
Okay. It's interesting. In every book on the paranormal, and I mean, we can go over there and look at all my books on the paranormal, they always mention the Great Amherst Mystery.
Absolutely.
It has great PR, but it's rather boring compared to Caledonia Mills. And the interesting thing about Caledonia Mills, a policeman actually went down, Harold Whidden, and wrote about it. Now, I've got some issues about his investigative.
Hey.
If
he's a police officer, he did a fine job.
Oh, yeah, right. Back then, yeah. Okay, listen, I've known when I went to work at the police club in 1989 as a bartender, I got to know some elderly policemen, and
you would have been involved in the intimate workings of the police.
So anyway, I learned the secrets of what went behind the scenes and stuff like that at the time. Now, of course, it's a very professional. They're all tofu eating and Diet Coke drinking people, but back then they were a total different breed. And anyway, Harold Whidden probably was this. I mean, it's not written anywhere that he was the hard drinker and type of thing. But anyway, he wrote the book on, and what was happening was pretty much the standard poltergeist. And the question was whether it was the mother or the daughter. And, there was family turmoil in there. The whole town got interested in it. There was talk about black dogs, which is I really love phantom black dogs. And also there was, some people had a theory that it was a vampire causing all this, which I think is really, really cool, but nobody wants to mention it.
That's the first I've actually heard of it myself.
When I talked to our producer director friend, that we're putting the shows on for, she just kind of, goes by it. And I'm thinking, that's just really fascinating. How can a town think a poltergeist is a vampire. But anyway, fires. It was primarily, it's called the fire spook of Caledonia Mills. So it differed from Amherst, which was knockings, writings on the wall, and like Esther Cox, you were mine to kill.
One of the famous,
yeah, exactly, with at Amherst. And for a while there, the house stayed there, then it became a Royal Bank, and then became a Canadian Tire, and I don't know what it is now. We must look into it. We actually talked about it on the TV show I did called Shadowhunter in 2005. And we spoke to the director of a play, and he spoke about how often it was cursed by doing that.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And the curse also applies to Caledonia Mills. Now,
yes, it does. So with the Caledonia Mills curse, they say if you take anything from the property,
that's where I was going.
Your house will burn down. Well, I'm proud to say, or maybe not, maybe I'll go home and find the fire department at my house, but I actually have a piece of the foundation from an investigation that we did with the Center for Parapsychological Studies in Canada. I took a piece of the foundation, because really, if you can find it, it's in Caledonia Mills.
But you only think you know where it's at. You've got to really, they party about it every year at St. FX.
Yes.
But
and every year it keeps getting more and more overgrown. So the year we were there, you could actually still see the foundation, and that's how we knew we were there.
But in 2011, I think it was, when I did the show Supernatural Investigator, you wouldn't even know it was there. It was so overgrown.
Yeah.
But we finally talked. It took 2 hours to talk a neighbor into taking us to the actual place. And on the way, you get to see where everybody thinks that it was and has their party. But the interesting thing to me was that if you go to Antigonish, and we had gone to the subway, and the guy that worked at the subway said, he knew about it. He'd only been in town 3 days, and he already knew about it. So it's got this vibe that is still going on. I don't know if the same thing happens with the Amherst mystery, but certainly with the Caledonia Mills, it has taken on this much greater iconic happening than what it really was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was talk of fairies because the horses had their manes braided, and, type of thing, and there were almost everything. It was almost like the whole kitchen sink, everything, and the kitchen sink was involved in that one. And that's twice now I've investigated it. And I'm also a friend of the author, Monica Graham, who did a book on it. And it's hard to come to any conclusions. But the interesting thing is, when we had the office for the shows, we were literally half a block away from where, the girl, and I can't think of her name right offhand, was working at Halifax. So, I mean, it was very interesting that we were almost, the center of the poltergeist, which eventually by 1925 ended. We were like half a block away from where she lived and worked with this Chinese laundry. So it was kind of interesting to know that, in Halifax, she eventually settled in Halifax. And was
Did she?
Yeah.
So Mary Ellen McDonald?
Yeah, that's it, Mary Ellen. Why don't I remember that? I mean, it's called the Mary Ellen Spook Farm. I mean, duh.
He's slipping, people. He's slipping. He's
Yeah,
not as young as this guy.
No, yeah. Well,
He did teach me everything that I know from the start of my parapsychology course.
Yeah.
I can't.
And you were an absolutely wonderful student. So
and then the other thing with the between the difference between Caledonia Mills and Amherst, there was no fires, I believe, at Amherst, right?
Exactly.
There might have been, and I might be getting the two cases confused. It's been a little while since I dug them up, but there was water at one of them. Was that water also at Caledonia Mills?
No, the fires were at Caledonia Mill. The water was at
strange water, which are actually both two strange poltergeist characteristics. Actually, a lot of people report mysterious water showing up or coming down from your walls, and then of course they call plumbers in, they rip everything apart, can't find any sort of source from the water.
Exactly.
And also fires can happen. It was happening a lot though at Caledonia Mills, and that's why they named it the fire spook.
it did happen a lot. The Catholic Church sent a priest down to investigate, and he investigated it very deeply, as did Harold Whidden, and actually, who was the guy from the Society for Psychical Research?
Oh yes, that's right. They were
Oh
involved.
my God, can't think of his name.
They were involved too.
And
yes.
they were involved. He came over. He didn't believe it was anything supernatural going on. But I'd be interested in knowing what the Catholic Church found. But that's locked away in the archives in Antigonish. So, yeah, well, nobody knows what he decided. But
Oh.
I'd love to read that. You know, be able to approach them and see if you can actually get access to that material. It'd be wonderful to be able to.
It's too bad they're not a government institution, because you could do a Freedom of Information Act
Yeah,
request.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So it's
Interesting. We'll have to look into that.
yeah,
See
but it's a like I've always said, it's such a stronger case than Amherst, but for whatever reason, Amherst took on, you know, probably because of the writing, Esther Cox, You Are Mine to Kill. That is a very dramatic thing. The element, you know, of menacing potential death, you know, I can see why that would be very interesting to, you know, various authors. And of course, what happens is authors copy authors. And so, you know, that's, you know, it got to be the great Amherst mystery. Whereas poor Caledonia Mills, still, even with the book from Monica Graham, is still, you know, kind of a backseater. And except, of course, in September when the college students go have their bonfires and, you know, drink. And so anyway, yeah, so it's a shame, but it's fascinating because it's bizarre. I mean, fairies and phantom black dogs and vampires and fires, and I mean, it's weird. It's just really, really weird, and it's like I said, the SPR did not believe in it. I'd be interested in knowing what the priest thought about it.
Yeah, that would be really interesting.
And you know, how she ended up in Halifax and just a half block away from our office at the time.
You know, I know Esther Cox ended up moving away. In fact, at one point she got sick and went to New Brunswick to stay with a family member.
Yeah.
And while she was in New Brunswick, the activity had ceased,
Yeah.
which makes sense because the living agent had left that house.
Exactly.
I'm trying to think what happened with Mary Ellen.
Well, Mary Ellen, essentially both of them, it had to do with sexuality. But with Mary Ellen, it was very direct. What happened with Mary Ellen was her fiance tried to rape her inside the carriage on the way to the house in the middle of nowhere. And this obviously would set her off, as well as the fact of the divorce and everything else that was going on at the time. And so, yeah, so if poltergeists are RSPK, psychokinesis, which I do not necessarily subscribe to.
What? We just heard from the man himself.
I know, but I don't. That doesn't mean I believe everything he said.
Although he did say that he has had cases too where apparitions are involved as well as RSPK.
Exactly, and that doesn't make any sense. And we had a case last fall with the woman in white, down in the near New Brunswick, New Glasgow. It's all new something around here, right? And so anyway, yeah. So I don't, and that violated the, what apparitions.
Yes, actually. So what happened? Before we let you go, we had an interesting. I don't know if it was a case, more like an inquiry.
Yeah.
Down around the New Glasgow area, and really cool story. This guy was with his wife and another couple. They were sitting around a campfire. And all of a sudden, he could see this girl, like in this old-fashioned clothes, kind of standing on his property. So he yelled out to her, asking if he could help her. She continued to walk right past the people that were having the fire, and she actually went to where the old bridge used to be, and you could still see like the pegs that were in the ground from the old bridge. And she crossed to where the old bridge would have been, but he had shouted at her one more time. And she had actually looked back at him and then continued off, which is interesting because in a residual haunting, We believe that it's energy that's been imprinted on the environment, and it's like a recording, and they will walk through walls and they will ignore people because they're not really a ghost or an apparition. Yeah. They're a recording in the environment. So this was kind of a strange case where it was initially sounding like a residual haunting based on the clothing and trying to go the same path that she always would have. Yeah. But to have a bit of interaction with the people as well, it was
weird. Yeah,
very unique. Yeah. The only thing that we kind of thought that maybe she wasn't looking back at him, because he had also mentioned that there was 1 or 2 kids playing. Yeah. And they were like kind of near the tree, and she may have looked back towards the kids possibly.
But that still was, anti-apparition activity. I mean, so it was bizarre because it's not a residual haunting. That's not supposed to happen.
No.
And the same thing with the Mary Ellen. I'm sorry, they always blame the girls. They're sexually something or other, frustrated. They've been almost raped, or they're growing. And, I think it has more to do with the puberty, and that I think it has more to do with the horniness of the investigators and the sexist beliefs of researchers in the past. They have said it is usually a young woman, and that's causing it because of sexual turmoil or whatever. Well, as soon as you hear that, that's bullshit, I think. But anyway, I don't throw it out, but I keep it as where, it's just one theory. And RSPK doesn't explain it. The poltergeist, which means noisy ghost, ghosts don't explain it. What it is, we don't know, and we're trying to put labels onto it. But the popular one is RSPK, repeating spontaneous psychokinesis, by a target, and in this case, it's usually always the girl.
Does seem to be a lot of females. The sexually frustrated adolescent was like your early poltergeist theories, and now what they do still find is that it's adolescents, but they don't say female. It could be any sort of adolescent. But I mean, there's been cases, we just heard from Loyd Auerbach of a grown female woman that can produce it as well. And I'm sure there's male cases out there as well. It just, like Darryll said, it does seem to happen with
a little bit more sexist towards females than the researchers and, than males. Yeah. And which would make sense if part of the phenomena is a social construct of society and the investigators, because you might have something really going on, and then you've got the reaction to it, the analysis of it. And of course, people look through things through certain filters. And I think a lot of poltergeist cases were filtered through the adolescent girl who's just coming into puberty, and because of this force inside of her, she's going to start throwing things like knives through the air and starting fires if you're Caledonia males. And to me, that just sounds like bullshit. I know you think it's RSPK, but you're wrong. It's as simple as that.
I heavily subscribe to the RSPK theory, so I find it interesting that Darryll doesn't per se.
At all. I don't know what it is. I'll tell you that. I just don't think that a girl can throw a knife across the room. I think that part was bullshit of the story. Now, the knockings, the tappings. Now, don't forget, some people have said they can, they could, especially with the Fox sisters who started off spiritualism with the knockings and the tappings they were Canadian, but it's happened in New York, and you mentioned it at the last podcast.
Yeah, Rochester, yeah.
Yes. They showed how they could do it, right, by cracking their toes.
Their joints, yeah.
Yeah, and stuff like that. So, I don't know what to think about poltergeists. I spoke to a world famous guy, Playfair, poltergeist expert, who was at the Enfield haunting and many other ones, and he totally, absolutely believes in it. I've got a book on the tapes that happened at that one, but I still can't come up with a cogent theory on what's happening with those.
What did Playfair say?
He thought it was, that's a good question. I hate the fact that you asked me that because I don't remember.
He must have alluded to what he thought.
The supernatural. He did not necessarily think that she, the young girl, caused it. He thought there was a supernatural presence as well. And that fits with what Loyd Auerbach said, that, here in the Western part, North America, it differs slightly from the Europeans. And be interesting to see what the other parts of the world think. The Japanese in particular, if you go on almost anything, YouTube on what culture or whatever, and you'll get the version of, the Asian versions of things, which are really cool. The best part, of course, is the Russia. I'd love to go to Russia. It's the most fascinating place for folklore in the world. It's Russia. I'd go there if I had a lot of money. But I've never heard anything about poltergeists in Russia. And,
there actually has been.
Has there?
I had a case in one of my, I can't remember now if it's Supernatural Encounters, the book that I have out, or if it's more Supernatural Encounters from law enforcement. But there was a poltergeist case.
Was there? Okay. The first time I heard one.
Out of Russia. I'll send it to you.
But you was supposed to read the book, but kind of skim through it a little. Yeah.
I actually gave him a free copy because he always gave me free copies of his books. I can't believe he didn't read my book. I have his books.
I read part of it. Okay.
I have my books.
I skipped a little bit. All right.
Mostly in the closet, locked away. But Darryl's, I keep specifically out in my office because I'm proud of them, and he doesn't even. And read
you
my
should
book.
Be. Okay, so I didn't read every single word. Okay, I'll go get it right now. For God's sake, it's right up there.
But I will send it to you. But you know what I suspect though is it's the same as oh God, we're having so much trouble remembering people's names tonight.
It's very late now. Okay,
there was a Russian medium basically, and you can find her on YouTube if I can think of her name.
I'm sure
but
you can.
She can move matches underneath glass. She can do all kinds of crazy stuff, and they would not let the parapsychologist take her and study her in the laboratory. The ones that actually did somehow manage to convince the Russian government to let them examine her, they had to do it into a hotel room. And I guess the experiments didn't go like as good as they did in the Russian laboratory and stuff because they never had like a controlled environment kind of thing. So I would almost I would hazard a guess that we're not hearing about really good Russian paranormal stuff because it's probably being censored by what's coming out of there.
Yeah, exactly. It's bizarre. It's really different, right? So that's why I love that stuff. But you don't hear the usual haunted houses, poltergeists, and this kind of thing. Instead, you've got some really out there holes, literally, to hell. Lakes that catch fire. I mean, you've got a whole bunch of stuff, right? And so anyway, this one thinks it's psychokinesis. I'm unconvinced. However, when we did Shadowhunter in 2005. I interviewed Michael Persinger at Laurentian University, which is being torn the hell out of because it's some kind of money problem, and they're dropping.
They're cutting everything.
Oh my God! It's like, why don't you just close the damn university if you're going to do that to it? Thank God Michael Persinger's dead because he'd be having a fit.
Yeah, and his unit probably would have got caught.
Yeah, he was a neuropsychologist. Now, I took one in neuropsychology, and then I went on to do the other stuff because I was interested in more social psychology and what happens with gay youth and suicide and all that kind of thing. And so anyway, he was speaking to me, and of course, 3/4 of it I couldn't understand because apparently we have more neurotransmitters than we did in the 80s when I took it. There was four at that time. Now there's got to be at least 8. And so anyway, I'm trying to keep track of this. However, we sat down, we got to his office, and we're set up, and we're going to do the interview. And he's supposed close as, actually the laptop is to me, and he's talking over this desk. And we were asking him about almost every single topic we were going to do with the 13 episodes. And before this, he was often a skeptic. He would come on and say something a little bit more, cogent. about it. So like Earth lights can cause, UFO sightings but they're really earthquakes and stuff like that.
Yeah, he was big in geomagnetism.
Yes, he was very big. So we're just chit-chatting and nobody's filming this because, of course, everything happens when nobody's filming it, like when Guy Playfair and I got along so well. And so we're just chit-chatting and he mentions just casually that he had a student and she moved a pen from one spot to the other in front of him, but just by looking at it, she was not touching the desk or anything. And I'm thinking, this is the guy who, is essentially a skeptic, looks for more mundane, earthbound things rather than weird things.
Yeah.
And I said to him, are you saying that woman performed psychokinesis right in front of you? And he said, yes. And because who it is, I have to believe in psychokinesis. Because if he saw it and he believed it, I can't, she was not touching the table. So I don't know how she moved it across. Some skeptics might say that, she tipped the table kind of underneath with her knee or some stupid thing like that. But he's too smart for that.
And you would think somebody of his caliber would have ruled all that stuff out.
Exactly.
Instead of going and telling the story. Yeah.
So I believe the pen went across the desk. I don't believe it's poltergeists or
it was RSPKs.
It was they could be, but I don't know what they are. And so trying to peel like an onion, peel the stuff off and try to find out what's going on. And it's funny that in Nova Scotia, we have the two most famous, or one most famous and one who should be most famous, poltergeist events. Nothing in Newfoundland, nothing in PEI, nothing in New Brunswick. I think you have to go to Quebec to get your next poltergeist event. And the Great Amherst mystery being world famous because of all the books. I could get them out and show you for God's sakes. So it's fascinating. I can't take your theses on it because I don't know. It's too weird at different places. So, but psychokinesis is sort of the common denominator. So I'm not going to write it off. And I certainly can't write it off.
He's coming around. Give me a couple more episodes.
No, I'm not going to. But because Michael Persinger said he saw psychokinesis, I have to leave that as a potential theory for maybe a little bit of the story, not the whole thing, because I think it was blown out of proportion. But anyway.
Well, listen, folks, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Whenever you're listening to this in the morning, afternoon, evening, it's evening here right now.
Very late.
That's why we're forgetting everybody's name. But
we're supposed to be experts in this stuff, and we can't remember simple names. I mean, you can tell it's almost 12 o'clock or whatever the hell it is. So yes, thank you very much for putting up with us that are sounding like idiots tonight.
We have a couple people in mind for future guests. We don't want to announce anything just because in case schedule conflicts happen or whatnot. But stay tuned, and I think you'll find some more of our guests very, very interesting.
It is as we develop this podcast and get find our beat, and we want to make it so that we're doing science, but we're also doing a bit of folklore fun. So that's why we were talking about the poltergeists, Mary Ellen and the spook farm. We want to touch base with where we are, which is, the Maritimes in Canada, but we also want to have a wider audience as well. So, but that'll all gel eventually. And, I've got a good friend who's also an author, and I've contributed a lot to his books. And he just said he would do it. And that'll be great because him and I get along on fire. It's just, we're really good. And he owes me an awful lot. So anyway, for doing all that stuff in his books.
Yes.
So
there's been a couple you've written stuff.
It's like 3 or 4 I've done chapters or things for, right? And which I was happy to do. So so we're going to have him and interesting people on. So it's going to be we'll develop it and it'll be fun, and we're going to disagree because that's just us. We've known each other for 20 some odd years. So And he's a little over energetic, just being a young punk. And I've been around, so it's like, you really got to show me something before I believe. So it should be a very interesting series of podcasts. So forgive us for this one being very long, but it was important being the second one. So
yeah, and we'll see you next time.
The Dueling Parapsychologists Podcast, an educational and entertaining podcast with Canadian parapsychologist Elliott Van Dusen and Darryll Walsh. To reach out to the Dueling Parapsychologists, see our Facebook page, Twitter, and Instagram accounts, or email us directly at info@ppri.net.